Well, mga kasangga, talaga nga namang pilit sinusulong ni retired Chief Justice Carpio ang pagka-disqualified ni BBM. Well, ating tunghayan muli ng sabay-sabay ang buong detalye. At kapag hindi pa nakapag-subscribe, subscribe na yan para tuloy-tuloy ang ating talakayan.
Very clear. There are two provisions of law that will support this disqualification. You have Section 12 of the Omnibus Election Code, which says if you have been convicted of a crime involving moral turpitude, you're disqualified, and tax evasion involves moral turpitude. Also, there's another provision separate the tax code. 253C of the tax code says if you're a public officer, you violated any provision of the tax code, you will be removed from office. You are perpetually disqualified to run for public office. You cannot vote and be voted for. Period.
Okay.
So he will fall under these two provisions, two independent, separate grounds. One is sufficient. If the other doesn't apply, the other can apply. Well, moral turpitude is broadly, it's an act that is contrary to integrity, honesty, good morals, and good conduct. And the Supreme Court said, ultimately, whether it's moral turpitude or not, it's for the Supreme Court to decide. Sinabi nila yan. So ultimately, it's the Supreme Court. It's a very broad definition. Anything that is contrary to good morals, contrary to integrity, to honesty. So, crime can be committed, and even if you are just fined, you can that can also involve moral turpitude. The Supreme Court, it does not matter that it's just a fine.
Okay. Well, when Bongbong Marcos was convicted in 1995, and that conviction by the Quezon City RTC was upheld by the Court of Appeals, did the Supreme Court already reach that determination that that crime of tax evasion in his particular case constituted moral turpitude?
Well, after the CA issued its decision, Marcos Jr. went to the Supreme Court to appeal. But before he could finalize his appeal, he withdrew.
Okay.
So when he withdrew, the decision of the Court of Appeals became final and executory. So the Supreme Court did not have a chance in this case to say whether it's moral turpitude or not. So we have to look at the other cases, and we have to look at what the Supreme Court said. In the end, we decide whether it's moral turpitude or not. So this will have to go back to the Supreme Court if the issue of moral turpitude is raised. And if the court COMELEC says there is no moral turpitude, the opposition, the opposite party will go to the Supreme Court. It's the Supreme Court that will decide.
Ultimately.
And if COMELEC will say there is moral turpitude, Bongbong will go up, and the Supreme Court will decide. So on the issue of moral turpitude, it goes to the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court said whether it's moral turpitude or not, it will be the Supreme Court that will decide.
Is that a case-to-case determination? Or
yes, because the moral turpitude, as the court said, depends on the circumstances surrounding the violation. And in this case, because the violation happened only in 1 year, 85, because the laws took effect only in January 1986. But you have to look at the surrounding circumstances, and that would include the failure from 82, 83, 84 to file ITR. That's the meaning of that. That's why this will reach the Supreme Court.
But for a reasonable person, how should that constitute moral turpitude? Let's say you're not exactly in the case of Bongbong Marcos, he's not destitute, right? He's the son of the late dictator. The family's rich. He was a governor and vice governor before, and then he didn't pay taxes as determined in court during that period, 1982 to 1985. So any reasonable person, you think, may or can conclude that there was moral turpitude?
You know, if this happened to an ordinary person, he did not file from 82 to 85, he would be sentenced to 3 years for each count. because he is Bongbong Marcos, they reduced the penalty to only a fine. That's how it happened, because the trial court said, I'm sentencing you to 3 years imprisonment on each of 2 counts. Because he is Bongbong, the Court of Appeals gave him a pass.
So that's what happened there? Because
Yeah.
that is quite unusual. I was supposed to ask you that. Is that usual?
It's very unusual. The way I said, it's inexplicable for the Court of Appeals to reduce the penalty without explanation. It did not explain why it was reducing it. And yet the law says you will pay a fine and imprisonment. So it's mandatory because he is Bongbong Marcos. And that's why I'm saying, if you are an ordinary person, you will be fined and you will be imprisoned.
So the letter of the law is quite clear. It's mandatory, fine
Yes.
and imprisonment.
Yeah,
It's
when
not
the
either
law
or.
says the penalty shall be fine and imprisonment, it has always been interpreted that is mandatory. There must be imprisonment if it says end.
Okay. Now my next question is, why would Bongbong Marcos go up to the Supreme Court if he already got a pass at the Court of Appeals and he was only asked to pay the fine?
Well, I think what the lawyer did was to play it safe. When the decision came out, just to preserve the right to appeal, they filed. And then they studied the case, whether they weighed, whether they should continue, because there is a principle. In a criminal case, if you appeal to the Supreme Court, the entire case is reviewed. In other words, the penalty could go up.
Okay.
So they had to assess this, and they said we're better off just being fined, because this error of the Court of Appeals could be corrected.
But
And,
would you
so
know,
they withdrew.
would you know if Bongbong Marcos paid the fine?
I've been trying to find out, and so far the Quezon City RTC has not found the folder, and we really don't know whether he has paid a fine or not, and he has not said that he has paid a fine. So he must state. We still haven't found the record that he paid.
Okay, again, for the clarification of our viewers, we're still talking of one of 2 grounds, right? The moral turpitude ground. We're not yet talking about the violation of the tax code. Okay, but in this case, in the case of that violation of the Omnibus Election Code, which requires a crime that was committed involving moral turpitude, can Bongbong Marcos also argue now that why should I be disqualified or prevented from running in the 2022 presidential election if I had paid the fine and there was no jail sentence based on the Court of Appeals decision?
Because even if you serve your sentence, if you are penalized, let's say for imprisonment of 1 year, even if you have served that, the disqualification is not removed unless expressly stated by law. In this case, if you have been imprisoned for more than 18 months, you are disqualified. But it says after 5 years, the disqualification is lifted. But that is if you have been sentenced to imprisonment. But if you have not been sentenced to imprisonment and the crime is moral turpitude, that provision will not apply. You will have to follow the general provision that a pardon from the president will erase the disqualification. Only a pardon. And so it's only the president who can allow him to run now. If he gets a pardon from the president, that will erase the disqualification.
In this case, there's none of that because
There is no pardon. As far as I know, the president has not pardoned. We don't know. I mean, there's no record at all.
Okay. Now, another question is, why was he allowed to run for senator and then for vice president in 2016 if there was this issue that he was a convicted tax evader?
Nobody brought it up. I mean, to tell you frankly, I learned about this only a few weeks ago when I received from one of my Viber groups that actually Marcos Jr. was convicted. So I was surprised. And that's when I started to make some research. So I think nobody brought it up.
So that explains the allegation or accusation of misrepresentation, material misrepresentation in that petition to cancel the COC, because candidates are asked in that questionnaire, right, whether they had been convicted
Yes.
of a crime involving moral turpitude.
Yes,
That's
there's a
what happened.
specific question, item 22. Have you ever been convicted of an offense with the accessory penalty of perpetual disqualification, which has become final? And he said no. That's perjury.
Okay. Now, assuming that the Commission on Elections, let's say, decides in favor of Bongbong Marcos, that conviction in 1995, as upheld in 1997, that he was a tax evader, did not constitute moral turpitude, can he also get away with the other violation of the tax code?
Well, the other violation, because it's malum prohibitum, and under the tax code, criminal intent to violate the law is not required because it's malum prohibitum. It just says any violation by a public officer of the tax code will result in his removal from office, perpetual disqualification to hold public office, and he is deprived of the right to vote and to be voted for. Period. The only way to get back your political rights to run or to vote is to get a pardon. And there is no pardon. So the other one, the moral turpitude is for the Supreme Court to decide. Here, it's very clear. You're not talking of moral turpitude. You are just looking at, was there a violation, conviction by final judgment? That's it. And there is conviction by final judgment. Is that it does not say that it has to be imprisonment for 18 months or more. Any violation.
And this will have to be determined initially by the Commission on Elections.
Yes, that's right. You have to bring the case before the COMELEC. And then the COMELEC is mandated under the law to decide this disqualification case at least 15 days before election day. And whoever loses can go to the Supreme Court.
Okay, but does it matter that, assuming that he had indeed paid the fine, does it matter that he did so in the case of Bongbong Marcos, to be able to try to convince the Commission on Elections not to deny due course to his COC? By virtue of the second violation, yung sa tax code.
Yeah, sa tax code, it doesn't matter whether you pay the fine or not. Because even your right to vote and be voted for is taken away from you.
Okay. Now, can the COMELEC also afford not to decide on this case?
Well, the COMELEC is mandated by law. The Omnibus Elections Code says all petitions for disqualification must be decided 15 days before election day. And more or less, they have complied with that in years past.
Well, Chief Justice, parang hindi pa rin malinaw. Manong, SEN.ENRILE, pakipaliwanag nga po.
Panahon na naman ng politika. Marami na namang pudyatan, maritaktakan, siraan, at kung ano-ano, mga paraan para mahadlangan ang mga kalaban. Kaya kayong mga bumoboto sa bayan ni Juan, pag-iingatan ninyo yung mga tao na yan. Sapagkat yan ang mga ginagawa nila magsimula pa noong matagal na. Hindi ko na matatandaan. Alam mo, Mang Jess, lahat ng mga sumusweldo, yung
buwanan.
salary, buwanan, automatic yun, tinatanggal yung tax mo eh. Withholding tax.
Withholding, okay.
Ang problema lang dyan, kung hindi siya nakapag-file ng income tax, technical violation lang yan. At mumultahan ka lang dyan. Punta lang. Dahil nakaligtaan mo. Oh. Sa akin lang palagay ko ang Korte Suprema at ang mga hukom natin, pagdadating yan sa kanila, sasabihin, prescribe na yan. Sapagkat kung yun nga mga prison mayor na kaso sa criminal law o temporal, nagpe-prescribe in 30 years. May 25 years, 20 years, may 30 years. Oh. Yung pa kayang sinasabi nila may tax evasion, walang tax evasion yan. Kung may rason na hindi ka naman makapag-file dahil wala ka rito, you have left the country because your life was in danger here, and there was a reason for not being able to a reasonable risk, a basis.
Tama.
Not to be able to file your income tax return. Di magpa-file ka at magmulta ka for late filing o no.
Tsaka
Kesa i-disqualify ka for a public office, mahirap yun.
At saka
Mabigat
naging
yan.
Mang Juan.
Well, mga kasangga. Kaya naman pala, hindi nakabayad dahil na-exile sila sa Hawaii. Ay nako, tama si Manong Juan, paso na yan. Lahat ka naman ng kaso may prescriptive period. Well, alam na this, baka naman, pwede nang mag-like, mag-share, at mag-comment. Diyos tiyag nina, apo, hanggang sa muli.